All right. I think I'm live. How's everyone doing? I am excited to talk to you today about this book I've been reading and that I just recently finished. It's kind of blown my mind. It's a book by someone named Antonio Damasio, who's a totally, really well-respected neuroscientist. Specifically, I think you would kind of call his focus the neurobiology of emotion. And in particular, he wrote this book called Looking for Spinoza. And it's kind of a strange book because he's a scientist, a very well-respected, proper empirical scientist. But he organizes this book around, a philosopher from, several hundred years ago. And the reason is because basically his research, his empirical neuroscience research, in his view, vindicates the very prescient kind of intuitions that were put together by the philosopher Spinoza. And so, yeah, he basically talks about how Spinoza was really more correct about ethics and even the body, even, kind of physiology than anyone could have known at the time. So, yeah, it's really quite impressive, not only for, how you think about Spinoza, to learn how accurately he kind of foretold a lot of ideas, or kind of, made some, I guess, intuitive judgments of how the mind and body work that turned out to be quite right, surprisingly correct, using the tools, the most sophisticated tools that we have to map out the causes and effects of the brain and the body. So, as I've said in the description, this is not going to be, a thorough review of the book or anything like that. It's certainly not going to be a lecture that's going to do any type of justice to either Spinoza or Damasio or the book or the topics at hand even. I'll give you a little bit of an introduction of the basic gist of the book. So at least you'll get that, even if you think all my crazy ideas are ridiculous and useless or unfounded. That's fine. You'll at least walk away with a basic understanding of the gist of the book. And then once I'm done with that basic gist of the book, I have just basically a bunch of rough notes on some of the stuff that I thought was most interesting. And I just want to kind of fire up this chat here, fire up this video here, and just riff on some of the things that I find interesting. So if you have any thoughts or comments, you can put them in the chat. And if not, that's cool. I'll probably ignore the chat box while I'm talking to try to focus on what I'm thinking, but I'll check it when I take breaks or whatever, or at the end, if you want to ask questions or whatever, we can do that. So, right. So, hey, Alice, what's up? Thanks for joining me. The first thing that blew my mind about this book is obviously, or how should I put this? It's actually a very obvious thing. It's not actually that profound at all, but I'm really ignorant about, neurobiology and stuff like that, and even psychology, that I was kind of blown away by something really simple at the very beginning of the book, which is, I mean, do you even know what an emotion is technically and what feelings are technically? Like, do you know the difference between emotions and feelings? Most of us have intuitive ideas of what these things are. I certainly, did, but my guess as to what these things were was actually totally wrong. So, I think the conventional way of thinking about emotions and feelings, like probably what the average person has in their mind, this is what I had in my mind, is that I actually thought you get feelings, which is a kind of like subjective state or perception of, I feel happy or I feel sad. And then emotions are like a higher level kind of product or consequence of those initial feelings that you have. Maybe you have a gut feeling that something is bad or good, and then that develops into emotions. Like you become consciously kind of depressed more generally, or you become consciously you have happy emotion or something like that afterwards. And basically, it turns out that's absolutely wrong. And this kind of intuitive, naive model of what emotions and feelings even even are is completely wrong. So I was pretty blown away to just simply learn the basic fact that actually emotions come first. Emotions are immediate physical changes in the body, technically, is what emotions are in response to some stimulus, right? So like anger, anger, for instance, is an example of an emotion. Anger is something that technically is constituted by physical body changes. So it has markers in terms of like heart rate changes, skin conductance, muscle contractions, things like that, and also brain regions. Like you can map the electricity in the brain in certain parts, right? So the physical markers of an emotion are actually physical changes in the body, and that happens right away. So in response to some, what he calls emotionally competent stimulus. So actually emotions get triggered before you even are conscious of them, before you feel anything. Hence, that's why feelings actually come after emotions, which is so simple to anyone who studies the stuff. But for the average person and for me, I had no idea that was even the case. So, and it's quite fascinating because I think it's quite counterintuitive. So feelings are basically the higher level secondary consequences where consciousness is basically perceiving the emotional state, as far as I understand it. I think that's basically right. So that itself was kind of like fascinating and surprising to me. But here's where his argument gets really kind of fascinating and even more counterintuitive, I think. Because then he goes on to look at like what exactly are feelings. As I just said, they're basically perceptions of kind of the emotional body state changes in some sense. But he's able to, through all the different research he's done and colleagues in adjacent fields have done, he's able to basically show with extraordinary kind of empirical precision and replicated detail that more specifically, feelings are perceptions of body states that are specifically in response to the brain's mapping of the body. So that might sound kind of confusing or technical. So I want to kind of try to break that down for a minute. Basically, your brain has regions that are dedicated to producing maps of body states. So, like where is the leg? Where is the arm? What is the temperature of the leg and the arm? Is the blood moving correctly or fast or slow or hot or cold? Obviously, this is very naive way to put it, but basically, you have regions in the brain that are mapping all of these different body movements and body states, and he's able to kind of tell you and show you what parts of the brain are doing that. They do this through experiments and different types of like medical catastrophes that help them kind of make inferences about which parts of the brain are really responsible for this. I'm not going to go into any of that technical detail here, for instance, but because I wouldn't be able to do it very well. And it would get kind of boring. If you're interested in that detail, definitely go read the book. It'll show you how it works. But basically, so yeah, your brain is producing maps of the body constantly. And it makes sense, right? Because it has to know what's going on physically in around the body to be able to, direct behaviors towards it. So by the way, I mean, again, I'm going to show my total kind of beginner's naivety, but if I recall correctly, basically the way this happens is through the bloodstream, like neurons. I believe it. Correct me if I'm wrong. You might want to Google this, but I think it's correct to say that you actually have like neurons, not just in the brain, but like going throughout or something like that, and also through like electrical communication. I believe. Well, I guess the neurons would be electrical communication. I think if I recall, it's like bloodstream stuff and then electricity stuff, basically. Whatever. You can read the book if you want to learn more about that. Clearly, I don't really know. But right, so your brain has regions that are mapping the body through these kind of communication channels, and he talks specifically about how it really is like a map. It's like it's just like in your when you kind of dream or you close your eyes and you think about the world, you're able to produce images in this kind of like theater like experience. Your brain is basically producing images or maps of the body states. Right. And so basically when that body map reflects a body that is in equilibrium, that is functionally, like healthy, everything is working correctly, that body image, that body mapping that the brain is producing, leads to positive feelings or affects. And so there are different types of ways to kind of categorize affects, but for the most part, we'll just focus on the main two, at the kind of highest level, which I think Damasio kind of, and Spinoza also just kind of call for shorthand, joy and sorrow. You can kind of split those up, I think, if I understood it correctly, into a few different types of, positive and negative affect. But for the most part, we'll just talk about those two to keep it simple. And right, so when the brain regions that are doing the body mapping have a map where everything is functioning smoothly and well, then that produces positive feelings, positive affect, so joy, in other words. But if it's producing maps that show disequilibrium, that potentially point towards death, disease, and these types of threats, then that produces bad feelings, negative feelings, or sorrow. Right. So that's kind of the basic idea. What's unique about the book, though, is that this is basically kind of Spinoza's intuitions, but apparently all of this is quite true, and you're able to kind of show it with pretty remarkable empirical precision, using all different types of experiments. So the book is the meat of the book is about drilling down into further detail into how we know these things specifically how they work. But I think that the end of the book, where he kind of, after going through all of the evidence for this basic model, after he goes through all of the evidence, you get some really interesting kinds of reflections where Damasio, although he's an empirical neuroscientist, he's clearly very interested in philosophy, clearly a careful reader of Spinoza, and he goes out on some limbs to make some kinds of ethical abstractions and larger comments on the book and on the findings. And I actually thought a lot of what he was saying was quite suggestive, and that was kind of really what gave me some of my more intriguing ideas about this neurobiology of emotion that is vindicating basically Spinoza's model. And so, yeah, what I'll just do real quickly, or probably not quickly, but very slowly and roundaboutly, is basically kind of go through them in an order that I think makes the most sense to me, at least. And it's good to note that we don't have too many people in the room today, so the chat is not too busy. So if people want to, chime in or ask questions or comments or whatever, it's at a volume that I should be able to handle it. So go for it if you want, and if not, that's fine too. So one of the things, hey Triggerati, thanks for listening. One of the things that struck me is that he talks about at the end how anguish about death and suffering is a biological problem, because the fact is that in our consciousness, we are, we're always kind of trying to perceive and sense like threats that are coming down the line, right? In our possible futures. He talks about how emotions are not just in response to like some object being presented to you, but actually they can be, they're partially a function of imaginary circumstances, quote, imaginary circumstances of our anticipated future. And so because we're, conscious, because of all of the living organisms, we have the highest and kind of most refined consciousness. What that basically means is like a higher sensitivity to having our emotions be affected by all kinds of far off threats and imaginary ideas or possibilities, and all the different possible futures that could occur. Okay, so because of that kind of radical open-endedness of the possibility of death and suffering and all the horrible things that could possibly happen to you or to your loved ones or whatever it might be, all the possible problems you can imagine, that, and also things like what happens to you after you die or whatever, even if it's just nothingness, that is that's not just like an abstract, existential issue. That's this is what's so interesting and kind of radical about this book, is that it's a biological problem. It's a real physiological kind of materialist issue, and basically, I mean, it can kill you in extreme sense, in its most extreme sort of forms. Like, people can get so emotional about the different threats of life and unknown possible futures that then it makes you kind of anxious and depressed, and then you kind of start fucking up with your life or whatever, and then you get even more depressed, and then you're even more afraid of possible outcomes. You know, biology has all of these negative feedback, all positive and negative feedback loops. And because of that, you know, yeah, basically the sub point here is just that anguish about death and suffering is a real biological problem with really serious stakes, basically. And so when you take that seriously as a biological issue, then what you start to see is that there are kind of like two alternative endpoints for how you deal with anguish and the large, you know, massive kind of threats to psychological stability that you know, living as a human being presents. It's that it can basically go in the good way of, you know, positive feedback of positive emotions, positive affects, joy, in other words, or it can go in the bad route of positive feedback of negative affect, sorrow, basically. And right. And so you notice already that we're starting to observe some kind of accelerationist motifs, like, because biology does have, you know, feedback loops, like because reality itself and biology, you know, no less, does in reality have this kind of non-linear dynamic kind of cybernetic structure. You know, it's worth noting that there are already some motifs that we also think a lot about when it comes to kind of technology and economics today. So I'll try to kind of work back to that later in my comments, because I think there are some really important ways to try and connect those things. But right, so anguish is a biological problem, and it can enter into feedback loops where it gets kind of exponentially multiplied. But basically, if anguish is producing negative emotions, its outcome can be tragedy. Basically, it can be depression, suicide, whatever, war, even if people are trying to kind of like deal with their, you know, this like emotional catastrophe through like aggressive projective techniques or whatever. But it can also produce like highly positive, exponentially positive affect also. And that's something that people don't, you know, quite talk about as much. But I think it came through really clearly to me reading the book, because on the one hand, Damasio talks about how basically tragedy is one word that you might use to summarize the negative kind of endpoint of terminal, you know, negative emotion. You know, like if the massive problem of anguish gets the better of you in a negative way, you're going to kind of accelerate towards depression, suicide, war, horror, dissatisfaction, hatred, tragedy, basically collapse, disease, death. All of those comorbid things are kind of the endpoint of having anguish produce negative emotion, overwhelm you with negative emotion. But there is an alternative possibility, which is glory, is the word that Damasio uses. I forget if that's the word that Spinoza uses, but, you know, if tragedy is basically kind of infinite, you know, accelerating, exponential, whatever, infinite, in other words, potentially infinite sorrow, then glory is kind of the shorthand term for, you know, accelerating, exponential, potentially infinite joy. All right. So that really got me thinking, and it especially got me thinking when he goes on to talk a little bit about religion, and so that's going to be kind of one of the other main themes of this talk. But before, you're right, because, well, how should I? I'll move to that in a second. For the moment, I wanted to point out something that Damasio says that's really interesting, is that he suggests at one point that because of these phenomena that I'm talking about, that you should basically seek joy at any cost. Because the idea is that, like, joy, like having joyful feelings is not just like it's not just like a positive possible decoration on life. It's not like, oh, you hope you have joy in your life, but if you don't, whatever, you just carry on with it. No, it's like it should be the highest priority of all living beings to do whatever they can to figure out what is going to maximize their joy, and to make whatever decisions they need to make to arrive at that joy. Because emotions and feelings are ultimately about like fundamental physiological life regulation. Now, here's the thing though, like emotions and feelings get a bad rap today, especially in contemporary political discourse, because the common conventional view of these things is that people are constantly in an irrational and biased way making arguments that are stupid and biased and false and manipulative, just because they're trying to kind of cater to their own feelings. And that's bad. That's stupid. That's regressive and degenerate and unethical. And yeah, all of these kind of comorbid negative adjectives accurately apply to that. But that's not a problem of emotions and feelings proper. That's a problem of instrumentally and opaquely and in a non-self-conscious way behaving in the world based on your emotions. In a way that's like not accurately calibrated. It's filled with biases and all kinds of subtle manipulations. So like if we're trying to have a political discussion about something and I shut someone down because an empirical claim that they make like hurts my feelings, that's just bad and stupid and unreasonable because of how I'm dealing with my emotions or feelings. In other words, like that's where all the problems come in with emotions and feelings, and why emotions and feelings get such a bad rap. And that's also why people tend to think about emotions and feelings as cognitively confusing. Like there's this idea that you should try to be cold with respect to your emotions and feelings, because to really understand things clearly and to communicate honestly and accurately, to get a true picture of the world, you can't let yourself be biased by your emotions and feelings. And so in popular discourse, there is this kind of widespread kind of just sense or intuition, I guess you could call it, that thinking clearly and making accurate, good decisions is like on one side, and then on the other side, very far apart and distinct and even mutually exclusive to some degree, are emotions and feelings. But that's really, really not the case. And I think that's another reason why this book I found really useful and quite radical. The key, though, is that you understand like the actual nature of emotions and feelings, and you have a sense of how, like, once you gain a sense of how they can bias, your perceptions or attitudes or behaviors, and you have a level of kind of like self-awareness to not do those things, then once you're able to discount for those, possible, unhelpful, confusing temptations to project that out into the world and do those kind of undesirable bad behaviors, then actually emotions and feelings are extremely valuable signals of what you're doing in your life that like is good and what you're doing in your life that's bad, basically. And Damasio goes as far as to say that one should basically seek joy at any cost, or at least that's kind of what I got from. I don't want to misquote him, but that's what I got from one of the parts in the last part of the book. And that makes a lot of sense to me. So in that sense, your feelings are actually the highest form of information and guidance on what you should really be doing with yourself and your life and how you should make decisions and act and think in the world. So that's pretty extraordinary, I think. And that's very much Spinoza. That's very much Deleuze. For those of you interested in Deleuze, I mean that one should basically make all subsequent decisions based on simple kind of personal estimations of what seems to kind of give life and give joy to you, and everything else is sort of downstream from that. That's a pretty radical idea, and it's kind of associated with certain radical philosophers, but there's actually extraordinary kind of scientific proof for it. Not only that these processes work and how they work, but that in fact it probably is true that the highest and best way of kind of regulating your life and making your decisions and organizing your future plans and everything, that it's physiologically and biologically and ethically correct. All of these things converge on the idea of maximizing joy at any cost. Okay, so now, because of the problem of anguish, Damasio talks about how we have a kind of evolved need or yearning to develop kind of like a meaning of life, having kind of overarching narratives about why we're here and what we're doing. That's actually a rational response to the problem of anguish. I don't know if he says it's rational, but he certainly says that it's evolved and it's adaptive. So in that sense, I would say it's quite rational to develop these kinds of overarching life meanings, and they're not necessarily going to be demonstrable or empirically valid in a scientific rational sense. They're going to be creative. They're going to be stories. They're going to involve all kinds of guesses and perhaps even aesthetic decorations that maybe give joy or something like that, but don't necessarily have demonstrable counterparts in empirical reality. So that's that. And obviously one of the greatest, most well-known forms of that is traditional religion, right? So here religion is understood as a kind of evolved affective technology, really, is I think the way to see it in this context. It's a created human structure to basically, I would say, deal with the problems of anguish, and also to kind of fold into that some salutary kind of ethical discipline for oneself and for a healthy community. And it's, how should I put this? It's scratch that. We'll just move forward. Now, okay, so brain break. I have to remember I'm not in a classroom. I can just take a breather. There's not like, stakes are low. There's no real performance pressure. Maybe I can read the chat real quick. Imaginary circumstances. I've always perceived Spinoza to be making the link between the physical and mental. Such becomes a habit or a process of the feedback loop, you imagine. Yitzhak. Is that how you say it? Ayo. All right. I'm recovered. Let's do it. So, well, I'll double back to the question of religion. We're gonna end on that note. But in the meantime, let's take a little aside. Let's take a detour and talk about intuition, because one of the things that struck me about the book is that Spinoza thought that intuitions are actually one of the higher forms of knowledge, if I understand Spinoza correctly, which is strange because when you think about today in sophisticated circles, in all different types of spheres, intuition gets a bad rap also, just like emotions and feelings. Intuition gets a bad rap because it's actually seen, I think, generally by many people today as one of the lower forms of knowledge. So, for instance, I have in mind, like, if you read moral psychologists like Jonathan Haidt, you know, intuitions are kind of this early, undeveloped kind of mental reflex, but they're prone to all kinds of problems and errors. And then the rational mind needs to kind of step in later, afterwards, to kind of rein them in. Same thing for people who are really interested in biases and heuristics. Like the rationalist community, if you read people like Scott Alexander or, like Eliezer Yudkowsky, all those types of people, like, intuitions are kind of the enemy. And it's reasonable to think that, because that's kind of where intuitions are very limited, right? They're filled with, biases and all kinds of faulty hardware. There are lots of traps and pitfalls, for sure, in intuition. And that makes sense. But that's why it's interesting and kind of fascinating and strange and intriguing to me that Spinoza found intuitions to be one of the higher forms of knowledge, and Damasio in his empirical research, seems kind of pretty sympathetic to this, because feelings, for instance, are really this like high. It's this high level kind of perception of the body itself, and you could not, if you tried in any way possible, like, formalize the calculations in consciousness that are producing feelings. Like, feelings are intuitive because they are at this like very high level of abstraction, doing something that only consciousness can do, perhaps in a still infantile way. Who knows where that will evolve over time. But so yes, it's faulty. Yes, it's imprecise. But you can also see it from a slightly different angle, as for that very reason, one of the, like, in other words, it's imprecise and so faulty and kind of messy and fuzzy, precisely because it's at this like highest evolved level, and because it's at that highest evolved level, it's actually one of our most powerful capacities to actually sense things that we don't have the capacity to formalize. All right, so that's really interesting to note, because I think that suggests some interesting ways to think critically and perhaps somewhat skeptically about, like, the mainstream kind of rationalist discourses. That is also going to be relevant when we double back to religion. Okay, so I want to kind of carry on a little bit on this point of intuitions. This is a bit of an aside, but that's cool. So something I've thought about a lot is that there is this kind of like secret political conflict between formalists and intuitionists, I think. And by formalists, I just mean people like the rationalists, who are kind of all about, like, if you can't show it to be true formally and explicitly with a system 2 kind of consciousness, then you shouldn't trust it, basically. And on the other hand, intuitionists are people who are like, no, basically the viewpoint I just gave you, that intuitions are in fact a high form of knowledge that one should even prioritize, possibly over formalisms in at least some domains. I think there's a secret political conflict between these two types of people, and I do think that they're kind of types of people that's probably caused by, like, temperamental differences, like personality differences and things like, and perhaps intelligence even. Some people who are really good at formal systems, if you're really good at, like, modeling, game theory situations, well, it's going to be in your self-interest to try and project that type of knowledge in as many domains as possible. You want to increase the demand for that. You want to increase the price commanded by people with those skills. It's a natural enough thing. People always are trying to kind of reshape the world around them in a way that caters to the skills that they do have and moves away from the weaknesses that they have. So I think a lot of the rationalist kind of sociology is like people who are good at formalizing things, kind of, getting together and saying, like, oh, this is the best form of thinking. This is the best form of trying to understand things and do things. and it makes sense because they're good at that. But some people who are maybe don't have that type of temperament, or perhaps they don't have the intelligence. It's an interesting question though. Like, I'm not sure the relationship between like intelligence and correct intuitions. Something we could look into more. But so I'm not sure if like intuitionism generally is kind of preferred by people with lower intelligence because perhaps they are not as good at like building the big formal systems. You could imagine that having good intuitions is also just a function of intelligence. But that's an open question. I'm not sure what the research on that says. Just kind of wondering here. And so, but still, intuitionists also try to kind of project an image of the world that extends and expands kind of the domain of intuition and makes intuition seem like more relevant than formalisms and more attractive than formalisms. And they try to kind of push the social game towards contexts that privilege, deployments of intuition, right? So I think you see this a lot, and I don't think that it's really I don't think that's really explicit. I think that intuitions have certain pros and cons, and formalisms have certain pros and cons, and there's not that much discussion or effort to kind of give each one its due, but there's a lot of kind of opaque, somewhat disingenuous and strategic efforts to kind of for one group to kind of shit on the other. And so yeah, ideally what you want is an accurate and unbiased calibration of formalism and intuitions. But notice I said bias. What's interesting there is, in other words, what I'm getting at is I think the hyper-formalists who are kind of focused on minimizing bias are actually, in ways they don't fully understand, kind of cultivating through kind of socio-economic, like competition kind of pressures, like their own form of bias, in other words, against like this higher form of knowledge that maybe they're not so good at. Yeah, so here's how I basically kind of see it. I think that intuitions they're flexible, and they're living, like they're very human, they're very socially effective. They're faulty in all the ways that rationalists point out. They're very faulty. But they're kind of very powerful, especially for identifying like issues with other people. Like if you're in like unhealthy friendships or unhealthy relationships or things like that, like, or maybe your job is like really, really bad for you, and maybe you're living a life of, deep resentment or things like this, whatever. These kinds of like very subtle interpersonal social challenges to living a full and happy and productive and flourishing life. Good intuitions are extremely powerful with respect to that domain, and in a way that formalisms just are very, very clumsy and almost totally intractable for those sorts of problems. And I think that also another data point for that interpretation is that people who have really strong intuitions and good intuitions, well-developed intuitions, and can deploy them and act on them smoothly and fluidly, tend to be like socially effective. And in other words, it tends to kind of translate into charisma, and people like that type of person and want to be around them and admire them and desire them. So that's what's good about intuitions. But of course, in all the ways that rationalists show, they are super faulty and prone to all kinds of biases. Now, formalisms are precise, and they're very good, obviously, for engineering types of problems. But they're like inhuman, really, and in a good way, even. Like that's what makes formalism so useful for engineering problems, is that you can build you can build systems that are larger than anything you could kind of hold in your brain in one point. By putting the mathematical symbols on a bunch of pages and making them connect systematically, you're able to create a structure that is smarter than anything you could kind of like feel or say in an intuition. That's why formalism is so powerful. But for that reason, for the same reason that it's very powerful, precisely that it's kind of this like inhuman extension of our brain, it's for that reason like socially kind of useless, or even a drawback at some points. So for navigating those like interpersonal, those subtle, difficult interpersonal issues that I was talking about, formalism is like a really pretty crappy tool. And by the way, I'm not trying to kind of like imply some sort of like emotional intelligence or something like that. I do know kind of the research on that stuff that, I do know that there does not appear to be like a separable form of intelligence called something like emotional intelligence. That's why I made my comment above about I'm not quite sure how I would say correctly what I'm trying to say about intuition. It's an open question, but all I'm saying is that clearly using emotions and feelings as a guide to decision making and action and behavior, that's all I mean by intuition. Whether that maps onto intelligence or something else, I don't know. But it's something different than kind of like rationalist formalism, and I think it stands certainly to reason that people, due to their temperaments, are going to kind of opt into formalist approaches or intuitive approaches to problem solving in general. I think that seems reasonable to me to say. And so, right, I think that actually this secret like war between formalists and intuitionists, I think it actually can help you decode a lot of peculiar kind of like cultural conflict today, because I think you see it in ways that are like really kind of hidden. So for instance, like look at someone like Jordan Peterson, for instance, and just like the bewildering kind of response to him. Jordan Peterson represents highly cultivated intuition, no doubt about it. I mean, his lectures are, the way that he speaks, the way that he writes, the way that he thinks. He's built his intuitions on, a lifetime of scientific research. And he's certainly trying to, obviously rationally develop them accurately and in an empirically sophisticated way as best as he can. But he's doing all of that work to kind of to channel them into felt, possessed intuitions, and that is why he's able to kind of like speak in the way that he does. That's like why, someone like Scott Alexander kind of referred to him as a prophet, or using a kind of prophet format for his work, because he's channeled, his intellectual endeavors into high level intuitions that he can kind of deploy fluidly in response to, his basically like his feelings of different situations. And that's one of the reasons why he's so charismatic and why people like him so much or whatever. But it's also why so many people, I think, like are really resentful towards him, because, what I've really started to realize lately is how a lot of academics, and academia kind of forces this on a lot of people. Academia tends to reward you for building, like formal structures. Publishing a scientific article it's a formal structure. It's a systematic structure that you have to build. And while you can kind of organize that into building personal intuitions, that's a very rare breed that does that. I think that's what Jordan Peterson's been doing for quite a while. But for most people, you just go about your work and you do your work. And if you're an academic, you're mostly investing in creating systems that are more sophisticated than anything that you could like say to a friend or family member. And so many smart people today, like in official mainstream institutions, they're smart and they've built up meaningful work over time, but their intuitions have been outpaced by their systematic kind of formal contributions to knowledge building and understanding. So their intuitions are probably, perhaps more accurate or more, better calibrated than many. But there's this major gap between their formalist, command of the world and their intuitive command of the world. I think, anyway, that's my sense of things. And so Sorry. So yeah, I think there's all this kind of hidden conflict. Like when academic critical theorists and academic philosophers and people like this say that like Jordan Peterson is full of shit and he's a snake oil salesman, and you see these sorts of cultural conflicts and disagreements that I find just so bewildering at first. Like, I think it's best understood as often having to do with a conflict between like fundamentally different forms of knowing, really, and different cultivated skills. Because here's the thing: like once you've kind of set down a life path in which you've cultivated one of these things over the other, you're really kind of all in. Like, in other words, an academic who has spent like the past 10 years just focusing on formal systems, like building academic articles and systematic books. Like if that's all you've been doing for the past 10, 20 years or whatever, and you're 40 years old now or 30 years old even, certainly older than that, like the idea that you're going to somehow like catch up to Jordan Peterson's level of like intuitive, kind of like fluid deployment of perception and felt ideas, it's not going to happen, really. And so it's like, rather than admit that, people would rather just shit on the the different types of capacities of the people in the other group. And you see this just as badly on the part of the intuitionists, like left-wing kind of like soft social science types, like soft qualitative methodologies and qualitative methodologies. I don't mean to shit on qualitative methodologies. They can be perfectly fine and good, but some people who choose to kind of really promote qualitative methodologies or different forms of what are seen as like the softer social sciences or whatever, there is a fair amount of, I think, people in those groups that are actually just trying to basically kind of slander the value and meaning and significance and power of like formal and quantitative knowledge. So I was mincing my words there because there are lots of good qualitative methodologists, and I'm not trying to shit on them, which is what a lot of quantitative people do. But basically, I'm just saying the intuitionists are guilty of the same thing that I think the formalists are. Okay, so that's just a thought. That's all an aside. I think we will move back to the kind of main thread, which is the stuff about emotions and feelings and such. So we've already kind of noted that the biological processes we've talked about have certain nonlinear dynamics. In other words, very sort of accelerationist motifs. And specifically the problem of anguish, I think the idea is that because all of the possible outcomes of the future, it's such a massive problem. It's so large and complex and almost impossible to process. And the stakes are so high, right? Like, if the future of your life takes one of the many possible like horror scenarios, horrific, all kinds of most horrific outcomes are imaginable. Like we can imagine them happening. And if you get kind of pulled down by that and you get depressed by that, or you handle that at all in the wrong way, in a way that fucks up your emotions and feelings, then you can actually start to tumble quite fast down precisely those paths, some of those paths of the worst possible outcomes. So that's what I mean by a kind of nonlinear dynamic. That's the accelerationist motif, right? That's positive feedback, which can go in a bad direction or a good direction. And I think that basically what's happening right now is that the technical and technological and economic changes that a lot of us are very interested in right now under this kind of accelerationist umbrella, for instance, unprecedented rates of technological change, but also empirical information available. I mean, just the sheer amount of data that we have on possible problems in the world, all of this stuff is exploding. And so when you think about that in relation to the problem of anguish and kind of the nonlinear dynamics of emotion, either positive direction or negative direction, then I think it really helps you decode a lot of what's going on right now, because I think what we're kind of seeing, or what we will continue to see more of, is what you might think of as like bifurcated affective accelerations or something like this. In other words, depending on different individuals and groups' attitudes and basically emotional kind of affective orientation to the world and its accelerating issues, people are going to be shot down increasingly positive or increasingly negative pathways. And I think whether you like it or not, you're going to be thrown somewhere very, very fast. The only question is, are you going to have the capacity to minimally steer that experience in a way that is at least attitudinally or, emotionally, and in terms of one's subjective experience, is that going to be joyous, or is it going to be sorrow filled? And if the accelerationist kind of worldview is correct, in that we tend to think about like the ultimate kind of nonlinear outcomes of possible processes rather than assuming that they're linear. If that is true, then what we might be looking at right now is not just kind of like bifurcations in, positive affect or negative affect, but actually like some groups will be rushing towards the worst kinds of like depressive, suicidal, horrible outcomes, and then other groups might be rushing towards glory. But the question is, what are the conditions under which those different affective bifurcations would accelerate into their different directions? And I think that mostly what we're seeing so far right now is like just the meltdown pathways. In other words, things like outrage culture, all the widest variety of obviously kind of disingenuous signaling behavior, and just kind of insane, mass, chaotic, childish, acting out of all different varieties. The extraordinary amount of resentment and anxiety that is just like overflowing something like, Twitter and Facebook or whatever, that is just kind of the norm of life today. That is, I think, most people being sent down a kind of affectively accelerating pathway to basically infinite sorrow, tragedy, in other words. And what we know from Damasio and from the neurobiology of emotion is that this is, materially, physiologically associated with disease and death, and that's not like a highfalutin ethical sort of reflection that I'm painting like a picture. It's like a hardwired biological phenomenon that we now understand the dynamics of. And so, but I think that's largely just because the kind of accelerating tectonic changes that we're observing and living through are still so young, still so new relatively. Like, we've only hardly begun to be able to adjust and adapt our like communication infrastructure, our intellectual, infrastructure, to use a phrase that Eric Weinstein uses, which is really good, is that we haven't been able to update our sense-making apparatus. It's woefully out of pace with all of the changing, technological and economic, phenomena that are fucking with us so bad emotionally, right? So my wager is that actually there are a lot of really exciting and promising openings or suggested possibilities for how we could actually quite rapidly, I think, and perhaps quite soon, engineer alternative structures where, look, I don't think, I'm not going to make any type of promise about how we're going to be able to kind of like save the world or anything like that. Not at all. But I tend to think more in terms of like the medium term, like how can we at least, maybe even if the world is completely ending or who knows what, in the worst case scenario, I actually don't think that. I just don't know. I'm quite agnostic about the immediate and medium term future. I feel like there's an extraordinary amount of uncertainty. So but it definitely does seem to me like things are accelerating to say the least. And I think that the correct solution to dealing with the current technological economic moment and its challenges just has not yet been discovered or fully understood. But I actually do remain optimistic. And I think that we might surprise ourselves with what we're able to figure out if we're able to map these different types of, scientific, psychological, neurobiological, and so on pathways that actually constitute the real mechanisms of human society, the organic mechanisms of this larger molar abstraction we call society. So it turns out that the more I reflect on it, and there's some stuff in this book that actually really, I think, vindicates this perspective. I think that religion actually probably does have, at least so far, the greatest known store of accumulated insights on social technologies for sustaining, apocalyptic, catastrophic, external stressors. So to me, it stands to reason. I think it stands to reason quite well that using religion as a base of knowledge for this sort of challenge, but simply updating religion using the full suite of data and tools and knowledge and communication forms that we do have. I think that is the pathway to that is the pathway forward. And the previous part of this conversation has kind of allowed us to lay out in more detail what exactly I mean by the way forward. The way forward to me is not overthrowing society or like instituting a new form of government that's going to like solve everyone's problems or something like this. It's certainly no, none of that. I think society is far too complex for any of us to even imagine that we could control it. Intelligence escape has already gone so far that the cat's out of the bag, the genie is out of the bottle, and we are now more or less all living within a techno capital artificial nature that just is the background of life today, and it's larger than us, it's more complex than us. We're not in the pilot seat anymore. So that is how it looks to me. But this book and other I think insights about human psychology and human behavior and philosophy also, I think they do give us the pointers of what we need to do to not only like just withstand these stressors passively, but to actually engineer them in such a way that they tend to shoot us off into exponentially increasing joy. And this is why I remain optimistic in a sense, because for the same reason that things look really scary, and for the same reason so many people are getting so kind of freaked out and anxious and depressed, and for the same reason that our societies seem to be like disintegrating to so many people, for the same kind of nonlinear dynamics, we could just as well imagine like equally extreme, equally rapid takeoff phenomena, kind of nonlinear exponential takeoffs that are just as extreme but positive and joyful, and that represent kind of increasing exuberance and vitality and health and life. I just think that we're really fucking confused, and not enough thought is being given to precisely how we can hack that. So I guess I'm kind of beating around the bush now. I've been kind of alluding to what I'm getting at, I guess, for a couple minutes now. So I should just move on to it. Well, I'll try to now sketch what I'm really getting at. I think that basically an updated form of religious thinking. I'm not actually saying an updated religion, like I'm not saying a new religion. I'm saying the true old religions. Whatever the true religion is, traditionally from all of time, to take that and to update how we think about it, update how we understand it. Because I think there are certain translations that can be made where you take kind of traditional categories that to us seem like ridiculous and kind of convert them to more scientific understandings that are consistent with everything we actually know about how humans work. First of all, so I think that can be done. I think that should be done. And I think that if we do that, I have a sense of like what that can achieve concretely. And we don't know until we try, but I can at least sketch out the hypotheses that I have. And so to me, it looks like this. One of the things that Spinoza is very clear about for producing joy, and that Damasio is also very clear about, is that you have to accept what can't be controlled. And so what this means is that one thing you have to accept, for instance, is capitalism. Despite all of its horrors, capitalism has become nature. Perhaps it always was nature. I don't really know. One can be agnostic about that. You can have all kinds of debates about that. But as far as any rational person can see today, capitalism is not like this arbitrary, contingent political system or economic system that can just be like changed or manipulated by some human being. It's in the order of reality because it's larger than us. It writes the rules that we obey, and in ways that we don't even fully understand. And so you have to accept. Step one is, I think, we have to accept, despite all of its brutality, you have to accept capitalism as nature. And in the Spinozan formulation, to Spinoza, nature is God. God is nature, basically. So what this means is that to live a healthy life, to live an accurate and not only like physically, biologically well calibrated life, but also to be the best version of yourself that you can be. In other words, to do good, you have to accept, maybe, I think, it's a hypothesis, accept capitalism as nature, as God. So there's an equation, perhaps, I think, between capitalism, nature, and God. And if you are willing to make this acceptance, your joy is going to increase. I think this is especially true for leftists, because I think one of the reasons why leftists are so depressed people, so anxious all the time, is that you're refusing to accept something that can't be changed. And if you refuse to accept something that can't be changed, if you're refusing to accept something that you literally, I mean, you have no idea how to change it. I've never met a leftist who has like a compelling kind of concrete engineering diagram for how they could effectively change capitalism or make, a fundamentally different way of organizing the complex society that we are in fact living in. That's not like, horrific. Something like Stalinism or whatever. There doesn't exist any engineering diagram through which humans could re-engineer capitalism into non-capitalism. So long as you don't have that diagram, so long as you don't have a way to change it, if you insist on refusing it, if you insist on, the imperative to change something that you literally don't have any idea how to change, that's just a recipe for negative emotion. That's like subscribing voluntarily to a world of pain and suffering. And as we've now kind of gone over, it's actually like submitting your body to its lowest possible functioning. and it's signing up for a vector towards death and disease. So, because there are so many people who think that way, if everyone were to accept what they can't control, there would be such a net increase in joy, which would, as we've already gone over, be a corresponding net increase in the ability to act. Maybe we didn't go over that. That's a well-known Spinozan kind of association. When joy increases, your ability to do things increases. You are able to learn about capacities or options that you maybe didn't even know you had, that you literally couldn't even see or feel or consider when you were in your less joyous or more depressed state. So there would be such a kind of upsurge of joy that it would fundamentally unleash new possibilities for thinking and feeling and acting that we don't even know what that could lead to. We don't even know what we would become capable of. You might have heard the expression, that we don't yet know what a body can do. And the irony here is that all of the most kind of passionate anti-capitalists who say, like, gosh, human communities could be so much better if only we, could restructure them. We don't yet know what humans are capable of doing together because capitalism oppresses them so much. The irony is that worldview that's a morbid error. That is basically a feedback loop of negative emotion. Because you're refusing to accept something that you can't change, you're artificially kind of suppressing your own joyous capacities. And you're basically kind of like blaming, resentfully, you're blaming something else for what is basically your own like willful refusal to accept reality. And what's so sad about that irony is that the actual prescription that they want is the opposite of what they're suggesting. In fact, what people need to do is accept what they can't control, and this produces the increase in joy, the liberation in capacities that they're looking for. And so, in this really, really strange way, just simply coming to terms with the equation that capitalism is nature is God is actually like it's almost like an esoteric anti-capitalism. That's like the true way to be anti-capitalist, is to just accept capitalism, be buoyed by the increase in joy that comes about, and then set about actually living the communal, liberated, emancipated human life that you want to live. And, that's communism, isn't it? Like, that's, I would say, not just communism, but that's heaven on earth. In other words, like, this is what I think religion has understood. It's that with the right orientation towards pain and suffering and the anguish of the world, with the right attitude towards it. And when I say right, I don't mean like rational or scientifically validated. I just mean the emotionally well-calibrated orientation to the biggest kind of problems and pressures that weigh most heavily on us. If you have the correct kind of, if you have ideational structures that allow you to process that threat and that problem in the ideally emotionally calibrated way, then you go to heaven, basically. And there's a reason why heaven is associated with this kind of like far off place in the sky or in the afterlife or whatever it might be, because in some sense that is like everything I'm talking about. I'm painting a picture of another place, of another life, of a way things could be different, and they're clearly not like that in any particular moment of everyday life. you have to kind of imagine it as out there, as almost supernatural. Because if it's not here, if I can't point to it, if I can't demonstrate it, it's, it's something like, it's imaginary. So in that sense, heaven is this kind of like far off idea that's extra rational. But if you think about it as being possible, and then you work backwards to think about how do you need to organize your ideational structures and your symbolic machinery, in other words, to best process in the most ethical and joyous way these like horrible problems and threats that cause anguish. If you do that, then, and you do it correctly, you actually do get a very concrete kind of winning outcome, which is essentially what heaven pretends. I think that's true. So in that way, it's in that sense that I believe in heaven, I guess. It is extra rational. It's not here. I can't point to it. In some sense, even by a rational, calculation of all that exists and prospects, it's not real. It's not real. I get that it's not real. I get that it's not rational. But if I admit that, and I say I don't need to be absolutely rationally certain about everything, I just want to create ideas and structures for my thinking and my behavior that make me feel as joyous as possible. So, for instance, going to confession has many salutary effects. I'll talk about those later. Whatever. Just take that as stipulated. If going to confession has several positive emotional effects that increase my joy and don't have any downside, then I'll go to confession and I'll keep going to confession. If a story about God or the belief in God increases my joy, then I'll do it. And what's so crazy about this is that if that then produces in me a new type of person that's able to do new things with other people, and I start hanging out with other people who are also going through that kind of like increase in joy experience, who knows what we're able to do? You don't know what we're able to do. But that feeling of joyful upward movement, that's movement towards heaven. And that is real. That is the part that's real. I think that's where I was trying to go with all this. I think that's all I have. Thank you. If anyone has any questions or wants to talk about anything, I'll hang out for a little bit. Let's see. Isn't this an instrumental relation to religion? Whereas the leftist view of a rejection of the world, this is by determinate negation, however problematic, has a more direct connection to its religious roots. Yeah. I think that's right. I think that basically you can translate what I'm saying into different registers, and I'm kind of showing, I guess I'm kind of showing how rational, scientific, empirical insight into how people work is like one register that can show the reasonableness and attractiveness of religious belief. And in that sense, it is in an instrumental frame. And you're right that there is a leftist tradition of rejecting the world that would appear to have a connection to religious roots. In other words, you could kind of see like leftist anti-capitalism, the belief that another world is possible, as leftists like to say, is very much like the religious impulse or instinct of, all that we have here on Earth is just, kind of temporary and crap, and, a better world is possible that comes in the afterlife. So, yeah, I see that. But I guess what I would say is that that's the dumb version of leftism and the dumb version of religion. Yeah. Like they can be translated into and out of what I'm saying. It's just like a dumber way of putting it, I think. Maybe. I don't know. I think my brain might be a little too fried from my long talking for an hour with no breaks. What else we got? Yeah, the larger point is that making yourself miserable clearly stands in the Christian tradition. Yeah. Well, that's complicated though, because there are ways of making yourself miserable that are a kind of perverse way of making yourself joyful. I mean, it's well known that the self-lacerations of the self-flagellations of, the saints, for instance, like that's a technique to produce ecstasy. So it's tricky. It's messy. I don't know. Also, like for instance, like the Christian injunction to like bear your, to bear your cross, to basically accept your burdens and responsibilities dutifully and without resentment, and to just do it, and to just do what you have to do, and don't complain and don't be resentful, and just get on with it. Like that, in some sense, you could interpret that as a kind of a positive correlation with misery and suffering, and almost like a will to bear suffering. But that's just, I think, how it looks to people who are not invested in the religious like conversion, because the religious conversion experience is a real, sorry, there's a plane going over. The religious conversion experience changes, it really does change the valence of such things. So like what to a secular person just looks like miserable drudgery, to someone who believes that same exact drudgery can be a source of joy, I think. So again, I think like religion is an affective technology for the conversion of suffering into joy, is maybe what I would say. And maybe that's why you can point out, correctly, many ways in which my argument would seem to be, like the opposite would seem to be true. Maybe that's because to secular people, it looks like the opposite of what is actually the psychological experience of the religious. Yeah, that's right. There is a form of ecstasy in leftist masochism. I think that's a good point. Yeah, so I mean, I agree that like I do think that like contemporary leftism is a religion. I think that's the confusion here. Yeah, like your comments are right. Determinate negation. Leftism is a religion. It's like what Moldbug says. It's like non-theistic Protestantism, basically. Like secularism and I would say secularism and atheism are also just variants of religion. Really, this is the Moldbugian argument, if I understand it correctly. non-theistic Protestantism. So in that sense, everything you're saying is right. These are religions, but I guess my rejoinder would just be to say that these are shitty religions that don't really do the glorious trick that religions are really capable of. And I guess that's why I lean towards Catholicism. I guess that's why I do believe in Catholicism, because I guess I see it as the one true religion that is the true source and pathway to glory. Maybe. I'm still working that out. I think that's what I think, but I couldn't fully explain why. I'm going to church as a neuroplasticity experiment. Yeah, totally. Absolutely. I mean, I could actually talk about that real briefly, and then I think I'll wrap it up because I'm feeling pretty fried. Like, I went to confession actually this morning for the second time. And if you've been following my stuff, you'll know I went like 2 weeks ago for the first time in about 17 years. I went again this week. I skipped last week. And so I went to confession, and the second time was much easier because 2 weeks ago I had like a long laundry list of sins. But one of the things that was really cool about going to confession this time is I had barely anything to confess. I had a few things to confess, but not much. And that felt really good. Like, what I realized is that when I don't go to church, like I haven't gone to church in 17 years all this time, well, here and there, but like these 17 years that I wasn't religious, I wasn't going to church very much at all, and I hadn't done any confession or anything like that. Like I wasn't really in it. Dabbling a little bit here and there, but was out of it totally for like 17 years. I, on a weekly basis, on a daily basis, you just have this like feeling that, you're kind of shitty. Like you feel bad about things. I think we know that people all have different proneness to guilt. Like that varies across individuals. Some people are more guilt prone than others. And I think there is a correlation between guilt proneness and religious belief. So that makes sense. But I think on some level, most people experience some forms of guilt on a regular basis, even just about little things. Like I constantly feel bad about not working hard enough, or I feel like I'm not doing well enough. All kinds of little ways, we beat ourselves up. We feel bad about ourselves. We feel it kind of ultimately has a structure of guilt. Like you feel guilty for not living up to certain things you could live up to, or for not, whatever. I think we all carry around this kind of like burden of guilt, and it's bigger or larger for other people. But here's the thing: when you're not doing some sort of like regular structured thing to confess your sins, it's really hard to get a proportion. It's really hard to get a sense of like, how bad are you really? Like if you feel guilty for not working that hard, or if you feel, bad about not doing some nice thing for someone you should have done, or you feel bad for making some mistake or whatever, like how guilty should you feel? It's really hard to know. Like that we're not really good at like calibrating that at all. And so you just kind of go on accumulating these like vague feelings of kind of self guilt, or self punishment, self hatred, or something like that, because you kind of go through like knowing all the time that you're doing some things wrong or bad, and kind of feeling guilty for it, but there's never any moment where like that gets discharged or emptied out or forgiven, because you don't have anyone to forgive you. So they just accumulate. And one of the things that is really unfortunate about that is you can have an overinflated sense of your own badness. Because, and I realized this today, because when I went to confession the first time, it was really long and difficult. But when I went the second time, today, I only had like 2 little tiny things to share about things I did bad. And walking to church, I was kind of like, as I was thinking about the things I was going to confess, I'm thinking like, the past 2 weeks, I've had my normal load of self-hatred and guilt and feeling like I'm lazy and not doing enough and treating people badly. And, I've had this feeling that I always have of being like kind of bad in many ways. But then when you go to confession and you're like, I can't really think of anything I have to confess for. I can think of like 1 or 2 things. Here are the 1 or 2 things I did bad that I'm going to confess for. You're like, oh, wow, I'm actually a pretty good person. Like, no, I'm not perfect. But when it comes down to it, the past 2 weeks, I didn't really do much harm. I didn't really do much damage. I didn't really do much bad. And that's a really good feeling. It's actually the opposite of what a lot of people think about like confession. Like a lot of people think that confession, it's this really kind of like macabre, self-lacerating, guilty kind of fixation on how bad we all are. And a lot of people think that's depressing. And like, why would you want to spend so much time focusing on the mistakes that you make and the little bad things that you do? It's, it's not that big a deal. Live and let live. Don't worry about it so much. Be happier. Don't be so depressed and morbid. I think that's the conventional wisdom towards things like Catholic confession. But no, that's really, really wrong. It's actually the opposite. It's that if you don't go to confession, if you don't have some sort of structure for asking for forgiveness from a community, then it's actually harder to live and let live. It's harder to be aware of your own basic decency. Your own self-judgment can become unlimited. And in a strange way, submitting to the confession of one's sins on a regular basis can, for a lot of people, actually decrease their kind of the amount of morbid energy that they invest in thinking and feeling about their own badness. Yeah. So that was a really interesting observation I had this morning. Again, this is an affective technology. It's another data point in this argument that religion is like a rationally evolved affective technology for increasing joy in the face of extraordinary anguish. All right, so there's some interesting stuff in the chat, but I think I'm pretty fried. I think this is a good time to wrap it up. It's been an hour and a half. Thanks for hanging with me, and thanks for your questions. The determinant, your last question about isn't there a conflict between Spinozist ethics and Catholicism? I mean, yeah, for sure. He definitely was not a Catholic, and so I don't really know where that ends up, but I'll try to figure it out. I'm just kind of painting with broad strokes my own intuitions, as it were, and I will try to think about these things more in these videos and in writing in whatever format seems best suited for figuring them out as I go. But yeah, you're definitely right. That's an obvious tension and very unresolved kind of hole in the series of reflections I've given. Yes, so good point. Spinoza sounds like pizza. No, it doesn't. All right, folks, thank you. I'll be in touch. See you later.